May 12, 1943. Vanderfield, Tarawa Atoll. The tropical air shimmered beneath the Pacific sun. The scent of aviation fuel and burnt oil hung heavy over the airstrip that had once been a stretch of coral and mud. A metallic click echoed as the fuel line was pulled free from a weathered F-4F Wildcat. Second Lieutenant Ethan Cole, 23 years old, wiped the sweat from his brow. His khaki shirt clung to him, the heat turning every breath into labor. He climbed into his cockpit, his hands steady, his heartbeat calm. Those hands, hardened by years in his father's repair garage in Oakland, California, moved with the precision of a man who understood machines. What he didn't know was that the next 15 minutes would transform him from a quiet mechanic into a name written in Marine Corps legend. The ground crew backed away. The canopy came down with a metallic thud. A sharp voice crackled through his headset. Condition red. Repeat. Condition red. Enemy inbound. Then came the words that made every pilot stiffen. Large formation, northbound. 200 Japanese aircraft. It was the biggest raid since Pearl Harbor, and the men stationed at Tarawa, barely 70 Allied fighters, were all that stood between the incoming force and the American fleet refueling just off the coast. Cole had never faced real combat. He had seen gunfire only in training films, but what the enemy didn't know was that this quiet, practical man possessed something more valuable than experience. He had an engineer's instinct and a warrior's nerve. Ethan had grown up in the whirring rhythm of machines. His father, Samuel Cole, owned a small turbine workshop near the San Francisco docks. The boy learned to listen to engines the way musicians hear rhythm, precise, mechanical, alive. He wasn't raised for glory. He went to public school, worked part-time fixing carburetors, and dreamed of flight. When the government launched its civilian pilot training program, he signed up immediately. The first time he lifted off the ground, he felt it. This was what he was built for. By the time he joined the Navy's flight school, he had logged more hours than many of his instructors. He finished near the top of his class and asked to serve with the Marines. A year later, he was stationed at a rough, muddy outpost called Vanderfield, the only Allied airstrip holding the Central Pacific Line. The Wildcat he flew wasn't pretty. It was short, bulky, and slower than the Japanese Zero, but it could take punishment like a steel hammer. The men joked that it was a flying safe with wings. The airfield itself was little more than a strip of steel planks surrounded by jungle. The tents leaked when it rained. The mosquitoes were relentless, and malaria took nearly as many men as bullets. But everyone knew, if Tarawa fell, Australia could be next. For days, the squadron had flown patrols without seeing a single enemy. Then just after 2 p.m., the radio call came in, the kind that makes a man's stomach drop. All pilots scramble. Launch everything! Fuel lines were ripped out mid-fill. Gasoline splashed across the tarmac. Ethan ran, vaulted onto the wing, and dropped into the cockpit. The propeller spun. The twin Wasp engine roared. The Wildcat clawed its way down the short runway, the ocean flashing beneath its wheels. He barely cleared the trees before banking hard into a climb. The sky above the Pacific filled with dots. Wildcats, Corsairs, and P-40s climbing like a swarm of hornets. Then on the horizon, dark shapes appeared. Bombers in formation, sunlight glittering off their wings. Ethan's radio crackled again. Bandits 12 o'clock high. All fighters engage. Good luck, boys. No fancy tactics, no speeches, just survival. Cole pushed his throttle forward and rolled into a dive. Below him, the first wave of Japanese D-3A dive bombers approached the harbor. They were slow but deadly, each carrying a 1,000-pound bomb meant for the American ships below. He lined up behind one of the trailing bombers, centered it in his sights, and squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat shook violently as its .50 caliber guns erupted. Tracers tore through the air. The first bomber burst into orange flame, breaking apart before his eyes. He pulled up, rolled, and dove again, another burst, another kill. In 90 seconds, 2 planes were falling into the ocean. His first taste of combat at Bur and his first victories. Then the sky erupted with explosions. Anti-aircraft shells from the ground burst around him, the gunners below firing blindly into the melee. One shell exploded so close it rattled his bones. Shrapnel ripped into his wing and punctured the fuselage. The Wildcat shuddered, but Cole held it steady, his hands working the controls with mechanical calm. Oil pressure steady. Engine temperature holding. He stayed in the fight. Ahead, 6 more bombers broke from formation, heading for the harbor unescorted. Ethan climbed high, then dove again, cutting through sunlight and smoke. He lined up the lead bomber and fired. The wings tore apart, and the plane vanished in a cloud of fire. He shifted aim, fired again, another down. He moved with precision, short bursts, no wasted ammo. The 5th bomber exploded mid-dive. The 6th took longer. He had to get close, too close. He saw the enemy gunner's face for an instant before pressing the trigger. The bomber disintegrated. 7 kills, 15 minutes, then silence, and his guns clicked empty. Out of ammunition. He could have turned back. Any normal pilot would have. Instead, Cole pushed the throttle forward and dove straight at the last bomber, trying to break its dive. The enemy gunner opened fire. Bullets tore through the canopy. Glass exploded. Fragments slashed his cheek and filled his eyes with blood. His oil cooler was hit. Black smoke poured from the engine. The propeller slowed. The plane groaned. He was losing power. Still, he leveled the wings and turned for home. Vanderfield lay 15 miles away. The smoke thickened. The gauges fell to 0. Then the engine seized. The propeller stopped. His fighter turned into a glider. He scanned the ocean and spotted a calm stretch near a sandbar. If he ditched perfectly, maybe he'd live. He popped the canopy, tightened his harness, and brought the nose up. The Wildcat slammed into the water. The impact shattered the nose. The cockpit flooded instantly. The plane began to sink. He tried to release his harness, but the buckle jammed. Salt water filled his mouth. He kicked, struggled, clawed at the belt. Finally, with one violent jerk, it tore free. He shot upward through the bubbles, lungs burning. His life vest failed, then suddenly hissed and inflated. He broke the surface, coughing, half-blind, bleeding, but alive. Minutes later, a Coast Guard rescue boat spotted the wreck. They pulled him aboard, bloodied, shaking, but conscious. Someone pressed morphine into his arm. Someone else handed him a bottle of whiskey. When they reached the island, the battle was already over. Of the 200 enemy aircraft that had come for Tarawa, more than 50 lay burning in the sea. The harbor was untouched, and Second Lieutenant Ethan Cole in his first real combat had destroyed 7 enemy planes, the highest tally of the day. Word spread like wildfire. Witnesses confirmed his kills. The squadron commander wrote his name in his report with one word beside it. Extraordinary. Cole went on to fly over 100 missions before the war's end, earning 16 confirmed victories. He was promoted to captain, later to major. He met President Truman in Washington, but when the war ended, he quietly returned home, back to his father's workshop in Oakland, back to the smell of metal and grease. He never called himself a hero. He talked about teamwork, about maintenance, about the importance of keeping your equipment ready. Machines don't quit, he'd tell the neighborhood kids, but men do if they forget their discipline. That was Ethan Cole's lesson. Not glory, not fame. Just precision, courage, and loyalty. In 2008, a documentary crew recreated his famous mission for a television series. The explosions were computer-generated, but the calm, steady voice guiding the audience was his own. He described his maneuvers like a teacher explaining a math problem. Patient, modest, methodical. He had always been that way. When Colonel Ethan Cole passed away in 2010, aged 89, Marine jets flew over his funeral in a missing man formation. The flag was folded, taps played, and the crowd stood in silence as the sky thundered one last time. 15 minutes had turned a mechanic's son into one of America's great airmen. But to the end, he never saw himself that way. He would have told you he was just a man doing his job. One mission, one flight, one heartbeat at a time. Yet history will always remember those 15 minutes over Tarawa as the day an ordinary man touched destiny in the skies.